going, and then those who joins is going to miss out on some really interesting debate. So welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming. Hope everyone is doing well on this lovely Tuesday afternoon. So we'd like to welcome you to our event, Green Infrastructure. How can we build a sustainable future? So this event has been designed and organised by me and my colleagues. We're all a group of PhD researchers, and we all have a passion for sustainability and contributing towards a greener future. So with this event, we're looking to drive discussion around the construction sector and the infrastructure sector, which is a sector made up of multiple energy-intensive industries providing multiple pathways for innovative and sustainable solutions to decarbonise. So currently, this industry is responsible for almost 40% of global carbon emissions. And the worldwide push for net zero emissions means that this has to fall by 50% by the end of the decade. So to move towards answering this question of how we can build a sustainable future, we ask you to join us in welcoming our esteemed speakers. So firstly, we have Dr. Brant Walkley, a senior lecturer in chemical engineering at the University of Sheffield. Thanks for the wave, Brant. Secondly, we have Dr. Danielle Densley Tingley, who's also a senior lecturer, but she's in civil engineering at the University of Sheffield. And we have Ricardo Moreira, who is a managing director at XCO2, which is a company that focuses on sustainable infrastructure. And to chair our panel is Dr. Rachel Rothman, and she's professor of sustainable chemical engineering, also at the University of Sheffield. As you can see, we've got a lot of University of Sheffield professors and chemical and lecturers here today. So thank you all for coming, and then thank you all for the audience for joining us for what promises to be an interesting debate. So today we are going to ask you to ask questions via the chat or via the Q&A option on the Google Meeting today. So as we mentioned earlier, you are unable to turn on your cameras and your microphones due to the large volume of attendees. So if you've never used Google Meet before and you're wondering where is the Q&A option, in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you should see some shapes. So there's a triangle, a square, and a circle. If you click on that, hopefully in one of the options will be Q&A. You can click on that, and once you're on there, there's a little box that says ask a question. So you can just type your questions into there. Alternatively, if you really can't find that, which I understand for people who haven't used Google Meet before, it can be overwhelming, then you're just able to type a question into the chat box. So this isn't the preferred option, but if you can't use the Q&A, then feel free to do this. To do that, you simply click the what looks like a little text box in the bottom right-hand corner and just put a message straight into the chat. So furthermore, we're also going to be live tweeting this event from the handle displayed on the screen. I'm in the top right-hand corner there. So if you want to join in the conversation on Twitter, then feel free to use the hashtag Green Infrastructure. So without further ado, let's get this debate started. I'm going to hand over to Rachel. Cheers, guys.
Thanks, Kyle. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you're all excited and have lots of questions ready for our panel all about green infrastructure. So one of my roles is I direct the South Yorkshire Sustainability Centre. So being able to chair this panel is quite exciting for me because one of the themes we have within that is decarbonisation of transport and infrastructure. And when we talk about green infrastructure, we're not just referring to buildings that have been painted green or even buildings that have green plants growing up the side of them, like the lovely one in the picture, but really about how can infrastructure and construction be more sustainable as a whole. So how can we move to a more sustainable future? How can we lower associated carbon emissions? So we're looking at the whole spectrum of sustainability, not just the green aspects that you might see in the picture there. So before we go into the discussion, what I'm going to do is ask our panel members to each introduce themselves. We'll go around a quick round of introductions, then each of them will have a turn to tell us all about what they think is important within this space, and then we'll move to Q&A. And as Kyle mentioned, if you've got questions, please do use the Q&A function and I'll be able to track them. And I think you can also upvote people's questions, as I understand. So we'll see how that goes when we start. So let's introduce our speakers. First up, Brant, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you, Kyle, and all the other organising members today. And it's really nice to be able to join this discussion today because it's about a topic that I'm very passionate about. So I'm a senior lecturer in chemical engineering at the University of Sheffield, and I lead the Sustainable Materials at Sheffield research team. Our research focuses primarily on developing low carbon cement and concrete for sustainable infrastructure and for waste utilisation and a circular economy. So a lot of the things that I can contribute to the discussion today will have very much a materials science and engineering focus, which I think is quite important for developing the broader green infrastructure that we need to mitigate climate change.
Sorry, lost my unmute button. Thank you, Brant.
No problem.
And next up we have Ricardo. Ricardo, can you introduce yourself for us?
Of course, and what I'll do also is I'll just share a few slides about ourselves. So I hope you can see that. First of all, thanks Rachel and organizers as well as fellow panelists. Pleasure to be speaking with you today. So XCO2, just introducing ourselves a little bit. I'm the managing director of the company. We are a 50-strong sustainability consultancy in London with an office in Singapore as well. My background is in architecture, but I've changed to engineering and environmental aspects about 20 years ago and been working ever since on projects around the world. XCO2 itself is a consultancy, and we do energy strategy, sustainability, and MEP engineering as well. So we work on projects around the world, as I said, a lot of UK-based stuff, but also master plans around the world, looking at how to decarbonize new and existing developments, working with private and public clients, and various aspects of sustainability as well, such as water supply, waste, and also things like biodiversity. So thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Ricardo. And last but not least, Danny.
Hey everyone, great to be here this afternoon. So I'm Danielle Densley Tingley. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Civil and Structural Engineering at the University of Sheffield. And I lead a research group that focuses around trying to understand how we can reduce our resource impacts on the built environment. And so what that means is lots of our work focuses on the circular economy, to different ways that we can try and keep materials in circulation for as long as possible, but not just materials. A lot of our work really tries to focus on that building level. So how do we make buildings stay buildings for as long as possible? Pieces of infrastructure are great examples, often of really long life assets. So if you think about our transport systems, some of them have been there since the Romans. Great examples of a circular economy where we've got things that are lasting a really long time. What's really important is that we do that with our whole built environment, so that we've reduced the impacts, but a little bit more about that later. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny. Right, what we're going to do now is we're going to go through each of our speakers to give us a bit of an introduction to their thinking in this space and their thoughts, and hopefully that will stimulate lots of questions in your minds for you all to put in the chat, and then we'll move into the debate section. So we'll go in the same order that we did with the introduction. So over to Brant first, who's going to tell us about the importance of green infrastructure.
Thank you, Rachel. So I'm going to talk about the importance of green infrastructure, but because of my background, inevitably I'm going to vary then into the importance of materials for green infrastructure, because my colleagues and fellow panelists on this discussion will be able to talk about other aspects like repurposing current buildings that are in use. So I think that from the perspective where my expertise can contribute, the materials science focus is an important discussion to have. So I think the first thing that I started to consider when I was asked to talk at this event was what I thought green infrastructure was and how we define green infrastructure. And I know that Rachel has summarized quite nicely the fact that we're talking not just about a particular aspect of green infrastructure, but broader sustainability within construction and the built environment as well. And so I think that broadly aligns with my view. Everyone would have a slightly different opinion as to what this means, because there are many ways in which we can make infrastructure in our cities or the built environment more sustainable, or as we would commonly call it, more green as well. So from my perspective, I think that a major criteria for classifying something as sustainable or green is that it promotes environmental well-being. So given that the discussions that we're having in this area, including the one that we're having today, are usually within the context of climate change, I think that the statement promoting environmental well-being is often interchangeable with lowering greenhouse gas emissions. Whenever we think of something as being green, as being sustainable, often that's very closely followed by the thought that, okay, that has low carbon embodiment, low carbon dioxide emissions related to that process. So because that then in turn limits the contribution to climate change that that particular process or structure has. So in my view, I think that for infrastructure to be green or sustainable, it has to lower the greenhouse gas emissions compared to the status quo. In relation to the built environment, carbon dioxide emissions from construction are one of the biggest contributors to climate change. So I believe the construction industry currently generates 40% of global human-driven carbon dioxide emissions every year. And so, of course, this will have a huge impact on accelerating climate change, and it's something that we need to tackle. So to achieve green infrastructure, we need to achieve green construction. There are a number of ways that we can do this, and there are many approaches that are already implemented in industry today. And as I alluded to before, because my background and expertise is in chemical engineering and material science of cement and concrete, I thought that I would talk primarily about the current impact of cement and concrete on our environment and what we can do to minimize this impact. So cement is a key component of our built environment, and cement is the glue in concrete. So concrete is the foundation of our cities and our modern built environment, and cement is the glue that holds concrete together. Concrete is cement plus sand plus aggregate, so rock, gravel, and that is then used to make our buildings, our infrastructure, our bridges, our sewer systems. So it's a very important material. The world produces more than 10 billion tons of concrete every year. And I think that it's important to take a step back and think about what a huge volume, a huge mass that is. So 10 billion tons of concrete every year means that concrete is second only to water in terms of global commodity use. So it's the second highest volume production commodity in the world. Portland cement is the primary type of cement that is used worldwide. And since the introduction of Portland cement, which was around 200 years ago, our built environment is now outgrowing the natural environment that has existed for millions of years, which is driven primarily by rapid urbanization. Cities are growing, people are moving from towns and country areas into cities. And I believe by 2050, 80% of the global population is expected to live in cities. So our urban built environment is going to grow. And we need to figure out a way in which we can make that transition more sustainable so that we can combat the effects of climate change. So I think that there's no doubt in my mind. So I view cement as somewhat of a magic material, which might sound strange, but when you think about the fact that we can produce a material that has allowed us to create engineering masterpieces like the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, the huge bridges, the infrastructure that our cities are built on, I think that's quite an amazing feat, but it also has quite a significant impact on the environment. Nearly half of all materials extracted from Earth annually are used in concrete, and cement production alone accounts for 8% of global CO2 emissions annually. So if you look at that 40% of CO2 emissions resulting from construction, well, nearly 1/4 of that is coming from cement production that is used in the concrete that's used in those buildings. Cement production also accounts for 25% of industrial CO2 emissions when you're just looking purely at industry, and 12 to 15% of industrial energy use. So it's a big problem. As we move forward into the future and other industries shift towards more sustainable practices, it's predicted that cement production is going to account for 25% of total human-caused CO2 emissions by 2050 as well. So this is why I'm quite focused on the material aspect of green infrastructure. How can we provide sustainable low-carbon materials for green infrastructure to be able to facilitate that transition to net zero? So there are a number of ways that we can reduce the CO2 emissions associated with cement and concrete production, including material change. So we can use low carbon cements that are based on recycled materials, so byproducts and wastes from other industries that can be processed and converted into raw materials for cement and concrete production. And we can also use ways in which we can develop more efficient, more high-performing cement and concrete materials so that we can use less of them for a particular structure, and that then reduces the CO2 emissions associated with them as well. There are, of course, inherent challenges in doing this because the immense scale that cement and concrete are needed on is very difficult to meet. So any new technology inevitably finds it very challenging to be able to scale up to meet that global demand for cement and concrete. That the status quo, the industry in the status quo is currently able to meet quite easily. So I think that's a key challenge. There's also the possibility of carbon negative cements that can sequester carbon from the atmosphere as well. But again, these technologies are in their infancy, and the scale up challenges to those are quite immense as well. Primarily, I typically focus on material change using lower carbon cements and alternatives to traditional Portland cement. But I think that considering other aspects that we can improve the sustainability of our built environment is also very important. So for example, repurposing or refurbishing and reusing existing buildings and infrastructure rather than demolishing them is a very important step, which means we don't need new materials that then won't introduce new CO2 emissions into the environment. And so I know some of my fellow panelists will discuss some of these aspects as we go forward as well. So overall, I think that the green infrastructure means sustainable infrastructure that promotes the well-being of the environment. A key aspect of this is to provide low carbon materials that allow sustainability and promote the well-being of the environment so that we can continue to build cities to accommodate growing population and growing urbanization, but reducing the impacts on the environment and also reducing the effects of climate change. So I hope that gives a little bit of context as to where my thoughts are coming from with the discussion today, and I look forward to the further discussions. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Brant. I love the idea of cement being the magic material. It's a great tagline for a material. Next up, we've got Ricardo, who's going to tell us a bit about some challenges and opportunities in the green infrastructure space. Over to you, Ricardo.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Brant. And I thought it was really interesting that actually we started with a building block. Materials are the building blocks of our cities, so it's actually quite, scaling up a little bit. It's a broad subject, as we all know, and I wanted to focus on three key areas that we are actually involved in quite a lot, and we think that it's actually quite an interesting areas for debate. And they are looking at the sustainability performance of new developments and using computer modeling tools to help design teams with that. Understanding climate change adaptation, how that's changing the way we build our buildings and cities in the UK and other parts of the world as well. And then the challenge of decarbonizing our existing buildings and cities. So I suppose starting with the first one, we are firm believers of getting the design right for a building, and that kind of scales up to master plans. But basically, when you are developing the built environment, you've got a unique chance of understanding the site and the climate that you're building in to ensure that you're actually taking advantage of the opportunities, but also protecting the occupants in terms of future thermal comfort and energy use, as well as other sustainability aspects. One of the things that we do is we work very closely with design teams, architects, to try to shape the design from early concept stages, so that they incorporate the principles of environmental design, which is exactly that. Environmental design is when you design your buildings and cities, understanding what kind of challenges they would have. And one tool that we tend to use more and more is, broadly speaking, parametric design tools. You might have heard of parametric design from an architectural perspective. So, Zaha Hadid would have done, very interesting designs with parametric tools, for example. What we're talking about here is more the environmental performance aspect of those tools. So how can you actually test hundreds of iterations of a design and its variations, and understand very quickly what impact it might have on energy performance, daylight access, overheating risks, etc. And these parametric tools are, have been developed a lot in the last, few years and continue to be developed. And a lot of them are open source, which means that, it's accessible to anyone. It requires upskilling, but, universities are ahead of the game in that sense, doing a lot of work in broadening the skill set. But tools like Rhino and Grasshopper allow us to test solutions for master plans to really kind of fine-tune performance. And those tend to be really the most cost-effective way of improving energy performance. But what that leads to is a type of design that is very much informed by the environment and the site. So an example of that is we've got a project abroad at the moment, and it's an urban design. It's a new city, actually. And the city itself is shaped around neighborhood hubs that incorporate good urban design principles, such as walkable neighborhoods, good public transport and cycling links, but also these hubs provide opportunities for use of sustainable services, so be it energy, water, waste, but also kind of the buildings themselves are designed with the right orientation, the right solar axis, and looking at wind access as well. Which leads me to kind of my second point here of climate change adaptation. So what we're seeing more and more is not forgetting about the mitigation aspects of climate change that we all have to address, such as limiting our emissions, but also understanding that the developments that we're putting in place right now will be around for decades to come. So how do we ensure that those assets will actually stand the test of time? And it starts by climate change risk mapping, understanding what the risks are that are specific to that development and that site, be it energy resilience, could be flood risk, it could be any natural impacts, but also things like impacts on the supply chain for a development in terms of kind of local economy and food source, for instance. One aspect that we get involved with a lot is overheating risk. And it's quite relevant to cities in the UK. London, where we're based, obviously has paid a lot of attention to it in the last couple of years, driven by the GLA and the London Plan. But basically, the UK is a country without experience in dealing with the sun. It's very much, it's always been about getting solar access as opposed to protecting yourself from it. I come from a tropical country, and my experience is very different, in which you actually need to protect yourself from it, because otherwise you won't achieve thermal comfort levels. So modeling designs early on to understand what kind of external shading do we need for buildings, how much glazing is good and acceptable, with natural ventilation strategies are now becoming important things to do here, because not only do average temperatures go up, but also kind of extreme events become more common and more accentuated. And on an urban scale, then we start looking at tools to understand what's called the Uniform Thermal Comfort Index, which is basically a combination of solar axis, temperature, and wind air movement. And it's basically an index to try to understand what levels of thermal comfort pedestrians will achieve externally. So we're doing a lot of research on that, on how to use tools to try to understand the potential thermal comfort outside of buildings and in cities. And finally, the third point that I wanted to touch upon is decarbonizing existing buildings and cities. And that's a very important one, because as you all know, the majority of buildings that we'll be occupying in the decades to come have already been built. And what's happened recently with the national grid is that there's been the decarbonization. So the grids become a lot cleaner. So there's a big drive towards electrifying your heating demand, for instance. The problem is that in cities, we have very little space for heat pumps. And so how do you provide then networks that feed on low carbon sources and zero carbon sources for these very dense urban areas? Is some of the projects that we've actually been looking at try to tackle that. Some examples are we've got a project in central London that is looking at using heat from the sewage system and then running it through a heat pump to feed a number of different housing estates in a specific area. And then moving down to the building side, we're looking at retrofitting existing buildings as well. A lot of it driven by corporations and their net zero targets, others by public housing and local authorities concerned about energy costs. Whatever the drivers, it's become a big aspect of what we do as well. And the challenges are there because you've got an existing building envelope, you've got existing systems. So how do you actually retrofit it in a cost-effective way? I think that covers kind of the main points, but I'll look forward to some questions on the subject. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ricardo. And I think that balance of carbon and cost is hugely important, and how our design can influence that in the first place. And I have no doubt that we'll be coming back to that in discussion, so I won't say any more about it now. Let's move on to Danny. And Danny's going to tell us a bit about the work she does in the space of innovation in green infrastructure. Over to you, Danny.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And I'm going to really build from some of what Ricardo was saying. So with, for me, when we think about innovation in green infrastructure, really, I almost want to challenge what that innovation means. Innovation starts with this implication that we're going to do something shiny and new. And I think actually, for me, the biggest priorities around decarbonising our infrastructure is not about shiny and new. It's about making better use of what we already have. And that is that first priority. So Ricardo was talking about retrofit and the work they've been doing. But the scale of the retrofit that needs to happen in the UK is massive. If we look to England alone, we have nearly 25 million homes. This is a very old and inefficient stock. Basically, none of it is compatible with net zero. We're still building new buildings with boilers. They're gas fired. That's not net zero compatible. So we've got this massive challenge, and that's just housing. Housing in some respects is easier because housing is slightly more typical in terms of different construction types, and we can categorize it and we know what systems we've got and what our options are a little bit more. As soon as you go into your non-domestic buildings, you've got way more different ways we build and different challenges that come with that. So I think for me, the first innovation we need to look at and the first thing we need to do when we start to think about how we prioritize decarbonising our infrastructure is about retrofitting our existing stock, appreciating the challenges, and also thinking about the fact that we've got a limited carbon budget to do it. So yes, we need to get to net zero by 2050, but to do that, we can only expend a certain amount of carbon before we start to go over our global warming targets, 1.5 to 2 degrees. That budget is pretty tight. If we start to think about what the building stock currently emits today, so our built environment is responsible for about 40% of the UK's emissions, and that's across its life. So both constructing new things, the embodied emissions that Brant was talking about, and the operational emissions from running our stock. So huge amount of emissions from that stock. They are taking up way too much of our carbon budget, and we're going to start to have lost our carbon budget and lost the gains we need to make in the next decade if we don't start to take really rapid action. So for me, starting to take that rapid action, and a lot of what our group does is try and understand what different things we can do at scale to bring about these changes. So one of the things we've looked at in the last couple of years was if we try and retrofit all of our domestic stocks, let's just focus on domestic stock, what do we need to do? Can we actually stay within carbon budgets? And what we found, if we look just at our housing, was we can stay within carbon budgets if we retrofit every single home with wall insulation. So about 50% of our homes actually have any wall insulation. Most of that isn't standard. So we need wall insulation in every home, and we're likely going to need some kind of electrified heat, in many cases a heat pump, as Ricardo was talking about. So if we did that to every single home last year, then we can stay within carbon budgets. So the scale of ambition, I think, is really underestimated, because actually we need to be starting to do things and ramp up deployment of retrofit really, really quickly if we stand any hope of staying within carbon budget. Or we need to accept that our buildings are going to take a much bigger proportion of our carbon budgets. And then you get into very interesting discussions on, yeah, but okay, well, if buildings are taking up a bigger proportion, what else is taking the bigger cut? Because industry is going to want a big cut, transport's going to want a big cut. So you have to have these trade-offs when you think about it at this kind of national scale, which to me is really important. And that comes to this linked point around making better use of what we already have. So we've got to both retrofit our existing stock so that it's more energy efficient and it's actually net zero compatible. But we also then need to say, when we say, okay, we need a new building for whatever that might be, or a new piece of infrastructure, well, let's question what service that's providing and can we do that within our existing built environment. Is there potential to extend our existing buildings rather than building new, so we can make use of that resource that's already there? A lot of emissions, our embodied emissions, are within our foundations, the stuff underground that we don't see, we don't appreciate. If I'm extending on top of an existing building and making use of reserve capacity within that existing structure, which most structures our analysis has found have, then I'm making better use of that existing resource. I'm still providing new space. I'm providing a different kind of space potentially. But I think those are the sorts of things we need to start to think about, how we do that at scale to provide where we need new space, and challenging how we start to repurpose existing buildings. Perhaps, and I think often there's this discussion when we think about an existing building of, oh, but it looks really sad and tired, and I don't want a building that looks like that anymore. But actually that's the outside of the building. That's not where most of the embodied carbon is. A lot of the carbon is in the structure inside the building. There's no reason in many cases why we can't strip that facade back, retain the structure, and then give you a building that looks very new, but you've actually retained a lot of emissions by keeping the structure and as much of the existing building as you can. And sometimes there's going to be cases where you might be able to adapt the facade, upgrade the facade, because you're going to need to do that for energy efficiency anyway. But you can also change how it looks. So I think there's this perception often that we don't want things that look old and tired, and I don't think that's what keeping an existing building means. I think we just have to be a bit more creative and a bit cleverer about how we keep that existing stock. So we've got that idea of making better use of what we already have, and for me that's really key. Sometimes we are going to need to introduce new infrastructure, and then for me that's when we need to start to think about how do we tread as lightly as possible. And I think there's two sides to that. Historically, we've talked a lot about, well, how do we have the lowest possible environmental impact with any new intervention? And that's really important. But for me, the coming decades are going to be, well, how do we go beyond that? How do we actually start to create things that give more back to our environment than they're harming in the first place? Because then you've got an argument for why we need to introduce something new. And that might be the service they're providing to a community. It might be the local job creation. It might also be whether they're taking carbon in from the atmosphere, as Brant was starting to talk about. So there's lots of different ways where a building might start to have a positive impact. It might be producing more energy than it uses. So there's lots of different ways we can think about that. But for me, where we then start to look at that kind of traditional sense of innovation, that's where we need those innovations for how we can have new infrastructure that creates that benefit to its local environments. But again, thinking about the scale, how do we do that? How many do we actually need? I think in the UK, if you look at how much infrastructure we have, we've got an incredibly established infrastructure. Let's make best use of that where we can, so that we're actually leaving valuable resources for the rest of the planet that maybe does need to develop in slightly different ways compared to the UK. So I'm going to stop there with those kind of high-level thoughts, and we can get into some of the detailed discussion.
Brilliant, thank you, Danny. And they're quite shocking statistics about what we'd have to do to every home. And I think you're right, people don't appreciate how much needs to be done, how soon, in order to actually achieve some of the net zero and the carbon targets along the way. Now, for all of those that are in the audience, or those that have joined late, if you've got questions, in the bottom right of your screen is a small triangle, square and circle. If you click on that, you'll get to the link for the Q&A. So please input your questions in there. We also have a few that were submitted in advance. So I'm going to do a few of the advanced ones now to give you all time to type your questions, and then we'll move on to the ones in the chat. And you'll also see in the Q&A section, once you've clicked on the triangle, square and circle, there's a thumbs up. So if you want to upvote other people's questions to make sure they get asked, then please do upvote other questions. And if you've got a really good question, hope that other people upvote yours as well, and we'll go through them shortly. So if we think about what all three of you have been talking about, there's obviously some stages of planning new things. And I think you summed it up quite nicely, Ricardo. You've got new developments, you've got retrofitting existing things, and then we've got that adaptation angle as well. So if we think about new developments first, and then we'll move on, how can green infrastructure be integrated into our planning? I think quite often when we start doing planning, there's almost a business need. We need some houses. We've got people, they need housing. Where are we going to put them? How are we going to do it cheaply? And the green aspect is not always the top of the agenda. It's the kind of addressing the need in whatever the community is. So how do we ensure that green infrastructure is integrated into that planning and development stage so that we have resilient, sustainable communities? Who would like to start with that?
I can try to tackle the beginning of that. I think that if we look at the success stories that we've had, in which speaking specifically of energy and carbon, where it's been implemented on a large scale, it's typically a public sector driver. It might be a master plan, it might be a local authority with a broader plan and targets that a region or in the case of London, a city might have and might require of developers. The reality is, if you're talking about new developments, each developer will have their own number one priority, which is making a profit. They're not thinking about what is a secondary benefit to future developments in my area, which is something you'd expect. But I think there's a role there for government to really establish the requirements and mandate some of these infrastructure improvements, as well as contribute to them as well. I think a combination of private and public investment is probably needed. But I would say you need to join forces, and the people who are able typically to do that are those in power.
I guess to add to that, from my side of things, I think I'd really like to see more ambitious planning. So in London, for example, now we have a requirement for circular economy statements for referable schemes. So for big schemes, they have to submit a circular economy statement. And what that means is they have to have, at least on paper, thought about what waste is going to come from their building and what waste they might cause by demolishing a building, put a new one in, and how they've designed that new building to reduce impacts in the future. I'd like to see us go down that route at a national scale, but to go beyond that and make it harder to demolish buildings. I think at the moment you can do it just too easily without necessarily having to justify, have you even thought about how much carbon is already in that building that we could save and retain if we kept the shell, just the structure, if we reuse the individual components. So for me, that extra level of ambition to then start to say, let's make it harder to demolish through planning. And you could do that through not being allowed to apply for planning for certain periods after a demolition permit's gone in, for example. And when we're then asking projects to put their planning applications in, I think more onerous requirements from a sustainability perspective. And that could be across, so I'm talking about kind of my area on circular economy, but there's nothing stopping that also being, have you thought about water retention and runoff and kind of lots of different elements of sustainability that we might want to build in at that local planning level. So for me, that greater ambition, embedding these kind of higher level principles into the planning process, that we have to show that you've really thought about the sustainability of a project. And maybe you're even starting to ask, well, how much energy you're going to produce versus how much you're going to consume, and asking those questions, and then really challenging projects that maybe are just using lots of energy, using lots of resources, and aren't giving anything back.
Yeah, if I may add to what Danielle said, I think some of the challenges that we have, we do a lot of projects in London, and I agree. I think the requirement to do circular economy statements and whole life carbon assessments as well is really important. One of the challenges that we come across is a lot of times developments can't really go beyond a certain level because of lack of a broader infrastructure. I think if we perhaps look forward to the coming decades and what could change to help that, obviously assuming that we've gone through the steps of maybe kind of normalizing circular economy, is really having a network of available products that can be reused, a market for used products. And that, that doesn't necessarily depend on any central government drive. It could very much be private entities developing that, and say large house builders or maintenance companies. But there is a lack. There's something missing in the market there, which is there's been a lot of talk about material passports and those principles, but in reality, there's very little available. So if a developer is actually keen on implementing circular economy principles, there is a limitation on how much they can do due to lack of materials.
If I could comment on that too, Danny. So I agree completely, Danny, that we need to be more ambitious with planning and implementing sustainability into that. And Ricardo, I think the challenges that you outlined there also happen for new developments. So we're always going to be having new developments. We're going to need new materials, even if we can repurpose as much as we can. And I think that one of the challenges at the moment for use of cement and concrete for construction is the prescriptive standards that require a minimum amount of Portland cement, which is the carbon intensive cement. And there's been a lot of work done in the UK in particular and across wider Europe in the last 10 years to actually include some lower carbon cements within the standards so that they can be used. But you're right, if a developer wanted to utilize some of the very low carbon cements that are available at the moment, it's not possible because there's no performance-based standards that would allow their use. The standards are based on a prescriptive content to say that it must have minimum 70% Portland cement, which is quite carbon intensive. So I think a combination of being very ambitious with our planning and embedding sustainability in that, but also having a lot of the current roadblocks removed. So we have the performance-based standards for new cement and concrete. We have ready-to-go products on the market that are sustainable would be quite helpful.
So there's lots of angles there for kind of policy and legislation and things, aren't there? And there's a couple of questions that follow on from this quite nicely in the Q&A. So one saying, well, where new infrastructure is needed, is there enough being done at national level? And it's interesting, Danny, that you gave the example of London having mandated something, and you do have to question, well, why is that not being done at a bigger scale, and how would it be done at a bigger scale? And it's actually followed very nicely by Isabel's question to say, how can local politicians do more? Which I guess comes into the same question. So maybe we can explore that for a few minutes about how this good practice can be expanded to national level, and what we need to do from a local or national policy governance perspective to achieve that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways London has very much led what we're doing in planning perspectives in this respect. And we absolutely need to see that level of ambition at the national scale so that we can uniformly do things across the country. As Ricardo said, there's a need to kind of upskill in what the circular economy is if you went down the circular economy statements, but that's not impossible. And there's certainly ways you could do that and steps you could do that. There's been a lot of lobbying within the sector about something called Part Z. So within our building regulations, we have different letters which talk about different bits of our building regs. And so the idea of Part Z is that we start to regulate our embodied carbon. We currently don't regulate. We operate our operational carbon, legislate our operational carbon, but we don't legislate our embodied carbon, the emissions that come from the materials we use. And that's gone forward to Parliament a couple of times, I think, at this point, as bills, private members' bills. and keeps getting pushed back as, oh, we're not ready to do this. But the sector is ready to do this by and large. Part Z has been created by institutions like the Institute of Structural Engineers. We're saying, well, we know we need to legislate this for us to make the steps. And you've got lots of the big construction firms who are signing up to that and saying, yes, we're ready to do it. So I think we do have a massive challenge that at the moment we have a government that doesn't seem to want to legislate in this space. Whereas we could, and we probably need to if we're going to get to our net zero targets. Equally, while we've got that national context, I think local politicians can absolutely do more by starting to adopt local planning, like the GLA has done. So you might well do it at that kind of regional level. But that ambition to do that, and I know Bright and Hove, for example, have started to look at these things. And I'm not sure if they've actually started to require whole life carbon assessments as well. So you can do it, and there are examples, but it needs that ambition to do it, I think.
Yeah, I think one thing to add to that is, the London plan has, in terms of its sustainability targets, we've been following it for, good 18 years, since there was one borough in London, Merton, which came up with a 10% renewables target. And this was in the early 2000s. And since then, it kind of spread out, and they've gradually built up on their requirements for new developments and major refurbishments. But there's been a big driver in the industry, which is LETI, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, which is an industry initiative to really push strongly for things like whole life carbon assessments and closing the performance gap between design estimates and actual performance. An interesting development recently is that LETI's changed their name to Low Energy Transformation Initiative. So it's no longer just kind of London focused, and they're actually going around the country doing talks. So I think there is very much a recognition that there's an opportunity to look at the positive experiences that we've had in London. And it's still not perfect. I think there's still kind of like a lot of challenges on planning here, but and see what can be applied elsewhere. I'm very conscious of the fact that perhaps there's an economic pool here that some local authorities can afford to impose higher requirements, and perhaps in other places they won't be able to. And then going up to the kind of national level, one comment I wanted to make is it's to do with the reuse of buildings and the fact that retrofit still requires VAT. And that is kind of a big obstacle, even speaking on a personal level, doing an energy efficient retrofit of my home. And it is so challenging because costs pile up there. And I think there is an incentive to demolish and build new, in taxes at least. And it's certainly, we suffer from a lack of a supply chain of experienced installers. Again, that's another big one. Lack of clarity on the subsidies. There are subsidies out there, but most of us don't know about it. So I think there's a lot that central government could be doing to help out.
Thanks, Ricardo. I'm going to come back to the finance angles in a minute because I think they're really important going forward. But we've actually got a question from Bill in the chat who says, within London, do you think LPAs will change their views and accept the loss of historic buildings that have no architectural or historic merit to improve carbon performance via new build developments? So facade retention might not allow maximisation of the site and allow an increased housing density. I think the question there is, can we get rid of the old building that's not very good and put a new one in its place rather than try and retrofit what's there, which may cost a lot and not be efficient? Although that may not take into account potential embodied carbon, I suspect. Danny?
Yeah, I think for me, the starting point there is we have to do the whole life carbon assessment to look at that. So you have to look at how far can we go with a retrofit, and then how does that compare to demolition and new build? And you've got to look at what that replacement embodied carbon is going to be. We've looked at this for some hypothetical buildings as well as some real case studies to kind of look at the spectrum. Often it's better to retain that existing building, retrofit it really well, because of the investment you're having to spend in terms of carbon to put a new building in. So if we say a new building construction on average is going to be around 1,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter squared. It's a lot of carbon we're investing if you think of the size of buildings we start to put up. If you go lower carbon, so you go towards 500 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter squared, maybe then we can start to justify it, but that's where you've got to have really, really ambitious targets for that new building as well, which at the moment we don't require. So I'd really challenge the question in terms of, we need to be looking at whether that's even the right question. Should we even be considering knocking that down from a carbon perspective?
Yeah, if I may add to, I agree with what Danielle said. I think that we do a lot of whole life carbon assessments, and it is challenging to match a scenario in which you retrofit a building to its maximum potential in terms of energy efficiency in comparison with a new build. The new build will have to do a lot of work to compensate for it. Tackling the question directly, I think the direction of travel is actually the opposite of what's been implied by the question. Local authorities are actually becoming stricter and stricter, in London at least, about demolition and new build. Local authorities like Camden, Westminster, and I believe the City of London have all brought in policies of comparative whole life carbon assessments if you want to demolish a building. So I expect that to spread out. And I would add, there are other non-carbon factors to assess when choosing whether to demolish or not. Of course, are the floor to ceiling heights appropriate? Is there enough flexibility for future use? Is there enough space? All of those are questions that need to be considered. But from a purely carbon perspective, I think that we'll find it more and more challenging to demolish buildings.
You've both mentioned the kind of need for whole life carbon assessment. And as someone who does life cycle assessment and sustainability assessment quite a lot, not necessarily on buildings, it can take quite a long time to do. And it's also quite hard to find people with the right skills to be able to do it appropriately. Do you think that there's a skills need there for people going forward? Do you think there's enough people with those skills? How do you see that area developing? And along with, is there skills? If we had to do a whole life carbon assessment on every single building in the UK we wanted something to do something to, we would spend our whole time doing whole life carbon assessment and not actually ever doing anything to the buildings. So how do we balance the need to have that understanding versus actually doing something?
If I may just kind of talk about what we see at the moment from an industry perspective is the only whole life carbon assessment requirements are for major developments when you want to build something new or a very significant refurbishment and GLA referable jobs. So the majority of projects actually don't have to do an assessment. And I would argue that that's probably right. As I think you're alluding to the fact that it might be overkill. But the other point of the question is that, yes, there's a shortage of professionals, and yes, there's been an inflation of salaries. Speaking from an employer's perspective, salaries have gone up a lot. And especially, I would say a year or two ago, there was a war for professionals with that type of expertise.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's still probably a skills desire in that space. We do little bits of consultancy, I think, particularly because people are finding they don't have enough people that they could go to that can do the whole life carbon assessments. And part of the reason we do that kind of hypothetical, more generic case study is so that every building doesn't have to have a whole life carbon assessment. It's that we get some kind of generalized rules of thumb that say, well, if your building has got these sorts of depth of plan, for example, because your depth of plan is such a driver of your operational carbon in terms of whether you can naturally daylight, naturally ventilate, you start to pull out some kind of patterns that say, well, for this use type, for this sort of building, massing, this feels like the right answer. We're generally seeing. Not in all cases, but you can also then start to look at that hypothetical case and say, well, the new build will be better if your embodied carbon can go under this number. So you can set those sorts of targets, which I think is really helpful, and then saying, well, that's your starting point. And if you know your new building's likely to be higher carbon than that, well, then that's when you question demolishing and putting the new building. So no, I completely agree with Ricardo. We don't need every building to have a whole life carbon assessment, but we need that generalized knowledge so that we can then start to say, okay, well, here are the rules of thumb we're playing by, and then it's the exceptions you're doing those calculations on, or you're doing it where you've got new materials. So maybe some of the stuff Brant works on, we need the whole life carbon assessment to demonstrate that this is a really good new material to be using, and it makes the case for that. So I think it's picking those cases, I guess.
Yeah, great. We're going to come to materials in just a sec, Brant, actually, but I've got one more policy type question first that Chris has put in the Q&A. Government climate policies here and in many other countries emphasize investment in green infrastructure. Do our political leaders recognise the scale of carbon emissions through the amount of building involved, or should they concentrate more on encouraging less material consumption?
Happy to give my cynical answer. I don't think they in any way recognise the scale of carbon emissions involved. And I think we do need a massive shift to less material consumption. And even just thinking about how we use our materials, I think at that political level, and indeed probably day-to-day public, I don't think we appreciate the impact of materials we use, both from environmental impacts, but also the social impacts of those supply chains. So I think there's much, much greater need for, well, let's use less and then figure out how we use more cleverly when we use.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think there's a need to invest in new infrastructure because we have to electrify our energy use. Boilers will have to be phased out, fossil combustion engines in cars and other transportation will have to be phased out as well. So, and there's a huge investment on the grid and on energy sources that is needed to support that. We've had projects in parts of London where they basically, some of them couldn't go ahead because the grid wasn't enough to support a full heat pump type development. And that's just the beginning of the transition. So yeah, huge investment is needed to accommodate kind of a zero or low carbon, I guess, economy.
One more
I guess it's how we do that investment with as little material as possible. We currently don't ask that question, do we? We don't worry about how much material we use.
Okay, one more big picture question. Is it better to intensify the density of one region or extend into a wider greenfield space from a sustainability perspective?
I mean, I can start us off. So my perspective and a lot of the work we've done in this space, from an embodied carbon emissions perspective, it's best to go up than out because you're generally making better use of your existing infrastructure. With that, however, as Ricardo was saying, we've got the infrastructure we need to shift to kind of a decarbonised grid. If you go up, you also potentially need more infrastructure investment in terms of your transport systems. But once the transport systems are there, you generally will use far less emissions to get around because everything's closer to each other than if you've developed a big sprawling city. And there's quite a lot of pieces of work that look at that and kind of say, well, denser, more compact cities are lower carbon places to live, both from materials, transport and energy use perspective.
Makes sense. Right, let's have a think about the materials we're going to build these cities out of. And there's a few questions. I'm going to put two together and I'm going to come to you first, Brant. This is your advance warning. So there's a question in the Q&A that says, concrete and steel are ubiquitous because they work so well in construction. What innovation in production processes are on the horizon to reduce or even eliminate the CO2? And I'm going to link that with another question that says lots of low impact cements use or come from materials from heavily polluting activities. So fly ash from coal-fired power stations, blast furnace slag, etc. When these materials are no longer available, how will low impact cement be made? So what are the innovations and how will we even have low impact materials going forwards?
Okay, I think I can answer them both almost at the same time. So in terms of the innovations, I think the major innovations that are happening now in cement and concrete production are in the in material replacement and material change, because Portland cement production, so this is normal cement that you see in all the buildings around you, is the efficiency of that process is near its theoretical maximum. There has been so much innovation and advancement in that industry in the last 200 years, particularly in the last 50, that we're at the point where, due to the thermodynamic processes occurring during that Portland cement production, you cannot really improve efficiency much more. And simultaneously, one of the big challenges is that carbon capture and storage is not currently viable for mass uptake for Portland cement production. The industry is so immense, so much is produced, and carbon capture and storage, while there's been a lot of advances, the technology for, in TRL level is still in its infancy. So the innovations are not really in improving the current process. It's coming up with a different process to make cement that works just as well or better than your traditional Portland cement, but using a different low carbon process. And so this is where material change comes in. So replacing Portland cement with other binders that are based on the industrial byproducts or naturally abundant materials like clays, limestone, these technologies can produce cements that perform often better than traditional Portland cement, but have far lower carbon dioxide emission embodiment. So, reductions of 80 to 90%. To answer so that's where the innovation, I think, is happening at the moment. And that's why I think that, in addition to being very ambitious with our planning, it's also very important to move away from these prescriptive standards that require Portland cement within a particular building. So if you want to use a concrete in a building, often you need to have a minimum amount of Portland cement. And this is quite restrictive, I think, for material change. So that's the innovations that are happening. In terms of what happens when some of those raw materials disappear, so the person who asked the question is right in that fly ash is a great example. So there's many materials that are used to make these alternative low carbon cements that will not be available in the future. We used to produce low carbon cements that contained fly ash from coal-fired power production, but that has been phased out in the UK and many other areas. So the stockpiles of fly ash have disappeared. So alternative materials have been used. Clays are very common. Limestone is very common. Other wastes, any sort of inorganic based waste from large industry can often be used or processed to be used in cement and concrete. So I think that the industry will shift quite naturally in the way that it did to accommodate the use of blast furnace slag and fly ash to new materials, particularly focusing on those naturally abundant clays, because there is no risk to security of supply there.
Brilliant. So that was all about cement and concrete. There's also a question in our Q&A about alternative materials, so focusing maybe on biogenic low carbon materials, which could have durability and compatibility issues. So what could be done to overcome those barriers to their use? I'm going to expand it a bit. How do we work out what material we should use where? Who would like to take that one first?
Yeah, I can start. I would say my first point would be figuring out how to use less materials, in fewer types of materials, but also less of it. Can we build more efficiently? Can we build smaller? Do we have an efficient use of space? And that, that's an automatic cost saving and carbon saving. And the other one is natural materials typically are the ones that will give you the best carbon performance. So it's an easy rule of thumb. Like stone will always be better than a aluminum cladding system, for instance, because it's just, the amount of energy used in extraction and transformation and is much lower than a metal, for instance. So keeping it simple, using natural materials, is similarly to what you eat as well, right? So the simpler it is, the closer it is to how it was kind of grown, the better it is for you. So I think it's probably a metaphor that applies to buildings.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Danny, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to agree with what Ricardo was saying there. And I think for me, use less, absolutely, music to my ears. And then going down the bio-based route, I think the points Brant's been making on performance-based specification are actually really applicable there too, because if we're specifying a performance, actually it's about what material can meet that performance for the lowest carbon. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity, and that can open doors. Yes, of course, there can be concerns with new materials and we need to do testing. And I think sometimes that's where financing is important, and maybe incentives to help us do that. But for me, going down that performance specification actually opens up those sorts of doors to use different things.
Yeah, so requiring not a particular material to be used, but whatever material to have a particular performance characteristic. And obviously any new material would then need to demonstrate that it can meet those performance requirements before it can be used.
I would also add that, since we're, kind of at a talk led by your university, I think the academia and universities have a big role in development of new materials and in collaboration with the private sector to test those materials. This has typically been the case over time, and I think it's an interesting opportunity for yourselves.
Always good to have opportunities for academia. Okay, let's move on to another question. So with the rise of smart cities, is there an opportunity to harness energy produced from our tech usage, either by retrofitting or otherwise? I don't know if this is angling at kind of how can you use heat maybe that's given out by some parts of the sector to go in others. There's a great example down in, I think it's Cornwall, where the heat output from a data center is used to heat a swimming pool, for example, which obviously on an operational carbon point of view greatly decreases that operational carbon. So thinking about a whole city level, is there opportunities to harness energy produced?
I think, yeah. I mean, if you're talking about the development of a new master plan for a city, absolutely, we should be thinking about that. Those opportunities are quite limited, though. A majority of cases, we're talking about existing cities, infill developments. So we might be much more localized solutions, but it's finding the synergies of users, as in the example that you mentioned. I think, in this particular case, it was quite a happy combination of users in the sense that data centers can be located pretty much anywhere, and there's a move towards bringing them closer to city centers for redundancy and reliability. So in a way, it works quite well. And obviously, swimming pools and leisure centers are suffering with energy prices going up. And it might be about finding these synergies to see what else can be replicated.
There's a comment as well, or a question from Pradnya in the Q&A. So another design type question: can parametric designing coupled with BIM and LiDAR be helpful in developing city level digital twins to identify and mitigate problem areas in terms of sustainability?
Interesting. So I've seen digital twins been used in buildings, not yet in cities, but yeah, I mean, sounds like an interesting problem. I think more likely than not, you will be looking at specific areas of cities that are suffering from a problem. An example might be a very dense urban area having wind tunnel effects around them, and then you have to analyze that specific area rather than having a model for whole cities. But yeah, there might be opportunities there as well.
I mean, we're using that kind of coupling of BIM or drawing plans of buildings and LiDAR to look at material stocks at a kind of city level. Not necessarily to identify the problem areas, but to identify the opportunities for things like adaptive reuse and material reuse. The amount of data you're processing, I think, is really hard to do at massive scales. And I think that's probably the big challenge that Ricardo was alluding to, that you might zoom in on a particular bit rather than going, let's model every single city in the UK, just because of computational power, the resource you'd need to do it. But I think there's definitely opportunity in leveraging these tools, particularly with kind of machine learning techniques where you can then automate from the processing and understanding of the data to move us forward, whether it's a digital twin or not. So digital twin implies to me live data, which is even more data. And actually our buildings, do they need to be live? We'll probably have a better, probably get a good feel if we looked at monthly data.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think, an example of where it's done at the moment, again, not digital twin, but a replica of a city or parts of a city, is with daylight impact assessments, that a lot of the companies that provide that service have actually developed whole models of cities, and where they can then kind of import models of new projects and planning applications and designs, and then test them with an existing context. So yeah, to a certain extent it already exists, but as Danielle said, not necessarily dynamic.
Great. I think it's time to move on to the big money question. So there's one in the Q&A we'll do first, and then I've got some others that were asked earlier as well. So should businesses be subject to incentives, sanctions or contributions where they are not using or supporting existing sustainable infrastructure? And this question is about, for example, lack of rail usage versus use of road haulage when new superstores and warehouses are built and existing infrastructure is impacted. So should there be sanctions against businesses that are not adhering to our sustainable infrastructure direction? I guess that's the paraphrase of the question.
I mean, I don't know about sanctions, but I think disincentivizing that absolutely needs to happen. So how do we make it easy for people to do the right thing? And I think for me, the question is, where do you legislate that? I'm not sure. Whether there's tax type, whether you could introduce a tax for things that are road haulage rather than rail, I don't know. Goes a little bit outside my area, but I think de-incentivizing rather than completely saying, well, we're just going to boycott, probably.
So where's the carrot and where's the stick, right?
I agree. I'd go with the carrot option because there'll be a lot of resistance to the stick. But I think it's essential that we provide incentives to embed sustainability in all aspects of the built environment and across all businesses and consumption behaviours as well. I think that for businesses, a lot of the driver is consumer-led. So if consumers want something to be sustainable, often businesses will try to tap into that market. And the other end is that if there's particular incentives that are provided by government, by legislature, then that will drive them towards sustainability as well. I think without that, it's not going to happen. We're in a capitalist society. Businesses, as Ricardo put it before, the bottom line is the most important. And so we need to find a way to provide, to couple sustainability and sustainable action with that bottom line. And I think that the incentives would do it.
Great. Okay. So what is the most efficient stimulus for building of green infrastructure? And this is a question from Anna. And the question gave a few options, and you can pick one of these or your own, and it would be good to hear your thoughts. So is it direct grants to householders and companies, or funding and loan guarantees channeled via local authorities, or statutory provisions in building regulations, or something else? So what's the most efficient stimulus from an economic perspective for building of green infrastructure?
I mean, I think if we knew, we'd have done it. I ultimately so I think it probably is a combination of those things. I think you need the legislation to move us in the right direction. Certain homeowners we know, and most people can't afford to spend, let's say, an average of 15 grand on a heat pump for their home. So we know we're going to need those incentives to make it affordable for people to make interventions. And as Ricardo was saying earlier, we also know we're currently taxing retrofit. Why would we do that if we want to incentivize it? So I think there's a series of different levers we need to pull. It'd be lovely if there was one magic bullet, but in this case, I don't think there is.
Yeah, and I would emphasize regulations. Unfortunately, there's all of them are important, but building regulations is really what is bringing that kind of minimum denominator in terms of performance across the board for the whole country. And it's really been, even though we still have a performance gap between kind of design stage estimates and actual performance, it's really been what's brought up performance in general in buildings. So we need more ambitious regulations, I would say.
Okay. And another question for you then, what is the role of the private sector in building green infrastructure, and how can public-private partnerships be leveraged?
I think they have a role in the sense of, their developments will fit into that infrastructure. I think I've kind of mentioned before, there are larger developments that could, London is an example of that. The London plan requires major developments that are within a certain distance of either existing or planned heat networks to either connect to them right now or be able to connect them in the future. So when we're going through planning, you need to demonstrate that that's the case. So that's an example where perhaps the developer will be required to invest in that, final 100 meters of network to connect their development. So that's an example where there's perhaps a mandate, there's been a plan, and developments fit into that. And then there will be the more ambitious ones in which they actually partner up to improve the local infrastructure together. So I think there's a role for it. Yeah.
Great. Right. I've got a couple of slightly different topic. Let's think about the impacts of green infrastructure on social equity. So I'm going to phrase it as a few questions, and then you can answer the bits that are most relevant for you. So how can green infrastructure address social equity issues and benefit marginalised communities? And I've also got a couple of questions that came from Joe about there's a severe lack of affordable housing in general, let alone affordable and green housing. So how can we increase the pace of development? And from a retrofit point of view, how do we think about the best plans to put social well-being and climate-centred lifestyle to the forefront? Or should we just create new futuristic towns? There's several questions there. Take the angle you fancy. Danny, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll start on the last one.
I thought you might.
So I think we definitely don't need new futuristic towns, as you can probably guess from what I've been talking about today. We need to make better use of what we've got. And to do that, I think we absolutely can think about, well, where are we prioritising our retrofit budgets effectively? And actually, at the moment, a lot of the budgets for retrofit are going towards social housing. So I think there's elements that are maybe happening in the right direction anyway, but then you've got pockets of society that from an equity point of view won't be in social housing, but won't be able to afford to heat their homes, might be living in really poor condition homes. And I think we need to look at those and figure out how we target interventions towards those. Particularly, I think they may well be in the rental sector, which can be notoriously difficult to retrofit. So we've historically been ramping up our energy performance certificate rating, which is basically how energy efficient is your building, and stopping you renting really poorly performing buildings. Being more ambitious there might be one way of doing it, but perhaps also providing more incentives, because the challenge with a retrofit is it may well be, or can often be, quite disruptive for a couple of weeks in someone's home. You can't impose that on someone. That needs to be a discussion and a choice. And I think bringing people into that discussion, a lot of social housing retrofit, certainly in the north, there's been some climate juries that are trying to basically establish from a tenant's perspective, what should we be prioritising, what should the approaches be? And I think more of those kind of consultative, community-led interventions could be really important as ways of getting more people invested, understanding, and then able to do that kind of group procurement, which again will need to be government investment, I think. But the group procurement can also reduce the costs, so it might be a more cost-effective way of doing it. But I think we have to have that conversation with people and figure out, well, what is going to make your home better? What are those key things that's actually going to make a huge difference? Is it a draft that actually might be quite cheap to fix? Is it you've got damp issues? Is it that actually the windows are really old and need to be replaced? Or is it wall insulation or roof insulation? So I think there needs to be those sorts of exploratory conversations. And to be honest, I don't think we understand enough, certainly in the engineering world, about, or the engineering research world, about where that social inequity is in our housing. And if there's particular problems particular groups are facing. I don't think we even have the data to be able to tell you at the moment, but it may be that there's a big role for research in that space.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think it's I completely agree, and I would say the speed of retrofit that you've alluded to, there's I think modern methods of construction have a role to play as well, in the sense of for instance, an example of energy sprung, which is a Dutch system or a methodology perhaps of retrofitting housing on a large scale that's been implemented in some parts of the UK already, in terms of kind of looking at external wall insulation systems that come in sort of slightly plug and play fashion, but also pods that can house heat recovery, ventilation and heat pumps that are attached to the side of homes. There's some interesting innovations there that can work for social housing and limit disruption. The other aspect I would probably mention is thermal comfort and the impact of climate change on populations at risk. Overheating risk being a huge one. There's very little thought put to the impact of heat waves that the buildings have during heat waves. So I think there's an opportunity there to look at that alongside retrofits, especially because energy efficiency retrofits might accentuate some of the impacts of overheating if you don't do anything about stopping the sun in, for instance, or providing good levels of ventilation. So I would say that area as well is when we're talking about the social implications of retrofit that we need to pay attention to.
Right. One super quick fire question before we start to wind up. Will a heat pump keep me warm in the coldest day in winter? That was one of the questions that came in on our Q&A. Ricardo, do you want to answer it?
Yeah, it can, but if you don't do anything to your home, then it will cost you a fortune. A heat pump on its own is not a solution. What the solution is to improve the performance of the building envelope or the building fabric. And alongside that, you look at then what implications you have. Say, if you improve the air tightness of your home, do you need to use mechanical ventilation with heat recovery? And looking at all of these aspects holistically, and heat pump is just a piece of the puzzle there. But I wouldn't recommend heat pump on its own without any other interventions if your building is older than a couple of decades old.
All right, panel, this is your 1 minute warning that your final question. I did have a question myself, but Isabel's put a question in the Q&A. It's the very bottom one. It's a brilliant question. So I'm going to ask all three of you to quick fire your one immediate tangible thing you would want a local politician to do or a motion you'd want them to introduce. But before we do that, Brant and Danny, you've got a bit of thinking time. Ricardo, there's a question that came through in the chat and you're going to have to answer it super quick, which is a challenge given the question. It says they see on the XCO2 website that Dalston Works is one of many successful projects focused on environmental targets. What challenges or obstacles does XCO2 anticipate in your journey towards sustainability in London or other big cities, and what strategies or innovative approaches are being explored to overcome them? It's a very big question. You've got 1 minute to answer it, and then we'll do the final question.
I will focus on that one specific project. That is the largest CLT cross-laminated timber building in Europe, at least at the time of build. One of the challenges now that we have with building low carbon materials and timber is fire legislation and limitations on height. And I think there needs to be a lot more research on materials, but also on the implications of timber, instead of perhaps sometimes a knee-jerk reaction. But if we want to decarbonize our materials, timber has a role to play. So that would be one challenge amongst many. To answer your other question, the one thing I would ask regulators to change, I'll stick to the VAT on retrofit. Simple enough one.
A good one. Brant, what one thing would you get your politician, or what motion would you get introduced for change?
I think I wouldn't ask them to do a particular motion. I would ask them to embed sustainable thinking into everything that they do and the areas they're responsible for, because it's not an isolated thing. Like, we've got sustainability that's not linked to everything else. As we spoke about before, green infrastructure does enhance social equity. It has economic benefits. So it doesn't need to be an isolated thing. And if we can link sustainable thinking to those other aspects, it will be carried forward, I think, naturally, as people focus on those priorities of developing profit or improving comfort and things like that. So that's what I would request.
Brilliant. And Danny?
I think, seeing as Ricardo's gone for that one, I would go down there requiring a kind of redevelopment audit of any building that you want to put a demolition permit in for. You have to have considered how you could redevelop it before you're allowed to apply to demolish it.
Excellent roundup of things there. So we've discussed so many different things this afternoon, and a huge thank you to all three of our panel, to Brant, Danny and Ricardo, for all of your input. It's been a very wide-ranging discussion, and I think the final points there have really summed it up nicely, that we need to think about how we incentivize retrofit, and putting VAT on it is not the way to do that, about how we embed systems and sustainable thinking in everything we do, including in, well, should we really be getting rid of this building, and how can we better use our embodied carbon that's there already? And there's some food for thought for everybody going forward. So thank you very much to our panel. Thank you very much to our audience for some excellent questions that have really led forward this debate. And I understand that there's another event later in this week, which one of the Grantham scholars will tell you about quickly. Oh, it's maybe on the screen now, is it? I've not pinned the right.
Yeah, so there's some of our other, so this is the welcome slide. Madeline, can you move it along to the next slide, please? Yeah, so later in the week, we've got another sustainability event, May the 18th, as you can see, at 5 till 6. So if you're free and fancy coming along to have a listen, then feel free. As you can see, as we spoke about earlier, the Grantham Twitter page is there, linked on. So if you want to follow any updates about the Grantham Centre or any sustainable work that we do, then feel free to visit that Twitter page. But I'm just going to say thank you to Rachel, Brant, Danielle and Ricardo for coming along today and in providing us a really interesting debate. I'm sure you'll all agree that we've had a great time listening to their views. And hopefully we've learned a lot. So thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Pleasure.
Thanks, guys.